Hello, my name is Stephen Holm and I'm with HomeGrounds, a place for you to go to learn more about brewing and enjoying better quality coffee. And today we are talking about the newly released Fellow Opus. This is Fellow's brand new grinder that can grind all the way from espresso to drip. And today we'll be talking about how it performs, what we like, and maybe don't like so much about it, and who we think it is for. Now, a word right up front, I do want to mention that Fellow did send me this grinder. They just wanted me to check it out, see if I liked it, and if I enjoyed it, then maybe I can make a video review. There was no promises or anything, and they are not seeing this video before it goes out, but just so you know that it was sent to me. I also want to mention that I will be putting out some more videos over the next couple days looking at this grinder compared to other ones in the similar price range and doing a similar functionality. So be sure to check out for those. So let's hop right into talking about the grinder, some features, and what all is going on in here. So inside of there is a 40mm set of conical burrs. It has a nice motor in there that is powerful enough to keep up with grinding for espresso on the grinder. Outside we can see it's a bit of an interesting shape. We have this large cylinder up here with the cylindrical catch cup at the bottom. Here on this lid is interesting. We actually have different volumetric measurements that you can use this for. So we have three sort of compartments. The smaller one is for 20 grams of coffee, so for an espresso dose. The larger area is for 40 grams of coffee, so for a brew dose. And then if you fill the entire thing, it's going to be about 100 grams of coffee. So that's a nice little system that they have going there. And then also inside of this lid, we have starting points based on what you're brewing and what grind setting they want to be at. So then moving right down from the lid, we have the actual hopper, which comes off really easily. We have 41 plus a little bit more grind settings. And the reason we have a few more is because not only are we able to adjust our grind setting with this, but if we take off the hopper, we see this blue piece, which is another way to adjust our base grind size. So I just have mine at the finest grind setting possible because I think that we have plenty of room on the coarser end for my coarser brew methods, but so I'd want a little bit extra on the finer end. And then right under there, you can see our burrs, which are easily accessible by just taking this little thing out, and you can easily put it back in. And then below there is our catch cup, and we actually have two options now for the catch cup. We have the standard one, which is meant for your brew coffee, so your bigger doses. And Fellow actually changed up the inside of this if you're familiar with the Odes catch cup, which I happen to have right here. Not only is it a different material, this is all plastic. It feels a little more flimsy. But on the inside, instead of having these metal fins, the whole thing is actually just molded that way. So it flows out a little bit nicer than the old catch cups. But since this grinder can also grind for espresso, if you are using it to grind for espresso, they also include this catch cup here, which just sits inside of there, and then you would grind right into here and flip this onto your portafilter. So it's a little dosing cup, and they have rings for 58 or 54mm portafilters. I like that solution a lot. I usually just leave this on all the time because I'm not grinding that much coffee, so I can just leave that there and then keep this somewhere safe so you don't lose it. We have the typical Fellow magnetic catch system that is popular on the Ode. And then down here we have the on-off button, obviously. And that is actually a timed button. There was a sticker on there when I first got this grinder showing you how many clicks is equal to how many seconds. So as an example, I think if you just tap it once, it'll grind for 30 seconds and then stop. I'm actually going to test it right now just to make sure I have this correct. Yep. So tapping it once, it grinds for 30 seconds and then stops on its own. Tapping twice. It's the longest minute of my life. So tapping it twice, it'll grind for a whole minute and then stop on its own, which those feel a little unnecessary. I guess if you're just filling this hopper and grinding on demand and not weighing or measuring anything, then those might be helpful, but I think for most people using this grinder, they will probably not use those settings, but they're there just so you all know. And then the last thing I want to mention as far as features on this grinder is it is anti-static, similar to the Fellow Ode, which that anti-static works really well, except there is one little flaw that I'll talk about here in a little bit. And then this grinder can be had for $195. Right now it is only available in black, but it seems like they are working on a white one that will be available at a later time. Now I'm going to do some tests to show you how this grinder performs, how loud it is, and a couple other things. We're going to start by just seeing how loud it is. So I'm going to get out a decibel meter here, and first we will grind without coffee. So it's only about 77 decibels, which is pretty quiet. Looks like it maxed out at around 83. So all in all, this is a pretty quiet grinder. I think they did a really good job keeping the noise levels down, especially compared to other grinders at this price point that can grind for espresso and drip. So good job, Fellow. Now, as far as the retention goes on this grinder, if you're not familiar with retention, that is just the amount of coffee grounds that can get stuck between the hopper and into your dosing cup. Usually there's just a little bit of coffee that gets stuck in there, and we want to minimize that as much as possible. And I found that it's only about half a gram that it's keeping in there, so not a whole lot. Now, the only thing I will mention is that through using this grinder, I found that it is anti-static down here, but I get quite a bit of static buildup in the hopper itself. It gets fairly messy after a while. It's not a huge deal, especially because you can just easily take this off and clean it, but just something that I do want to point out. The last test that I did is I did some grind distribution graphs. If you're unfamiliar with those, it is basically just looking at each setting on the grinder and seeing how fine it's grinding, and then also how uniform those grounds are to a specific size. So for example, at setting 5, the grounds might be at, say, 1,000 microns, which is good for a pour over cup of coffee or something like that. But we want to see how that increases, what the range is on the grinder, and how uniform those graphs actually are. So I'll throw up a couple graphs on screen. This first one is going to be the average sides at each grind setting going up. So we can see at the very bottom, we are very fine. We're at around 400 to 500 microns, and then it climbs all the way up. This grinder grinds pretty linearly, so as we go up in grind size, we're going equally up until we reach a very coarse setting. The uniformity within each of those grind settings is fairly good. I've seen other grinders, such as the Fellow Ode, that do a lot better, but for a cheap meaning $200, for a cheap grinder that can do all of these different settings, I think the uniformity is fairly good. So now I'm going to hop into espresso, because I think that using this for espresso is going to be a big selling point for Fellow. It's one of the biggest things they're advertising, because their other grinder, the Fellow Ode, is not designed for espresso. So now that they have this grinder out, they can say, hey, we have an espresso grinder as well, and it can grind for drip. So I'm going to dial in an espresso right now using a coffee I haven't used with this grinder yet, and we're going to see how easy it is to get a good shot of espresso. So I've got this coffee here from Equator Coffees. It is a coffee from El Salvador, and this is actually from the Fellow subscription program. So if you're unfamiliar with that, I highly recommend it. Be sure to check it out. I'm going to be doing a shot of about 20 grams of coffee with a yield of 40 grams and aiming for about 30 seconds. That's my usual starting point for an espresso. And I will show you just kind of how easy or not so easy it is to dial in an espresso with this grinder. I'm going to start on setting 2, and we will see how that works. So because of that retention that I mentioned earlier, I weighed out 20.4 grams of coffee, and I will measure out how much we get out just so we can verify that number. So we got out 19.7 grams, so we lost about 0.7 through there. I'm going to put this in here and just give it a little knock knock. Maybe another quick grind. Let's see how much now. Now we have 19.8, so got a little bit more out. I do wish that this grinder had the knocker like the Fellow Ode has. That's a huge thing that really helps get out all that extra coffee in there. And I feel like it would have been pretty easy for them to put it on there, but one little trick I have used is using the lid as sort of a bellows. So I'll just sort of push it down. It's pretty airtight on there, so I have a good feeling that it is putting air pressure through the burrs and hopefully getting a little bit more coffee out. Yeah, so now we have 20 grams. So that got out an extra 0.2 grams. So this lid can be used as sort of a little makeshift bellows, which is nice. So now I can show you that using that dosing cup in there, we have this. I put my portafilter on there and flip it, and we have our coffee in. The grinds aren't too clumpy, but I still like to do some WDT, so just mixing it up a little bit before I tamp and then pull the shot. Okay, so once again, this was a 20-gram dose, ground at setting 2 on the Fellow Opus. Now I'm going to aim for a 40-gram yield. So that was a 40-gram yield in about 35 seconds. So pretty good for a first shot. So I'm going to start by giving this a taste, and we'll talk about how the espresso tastes from this grinder, but then I'm going to do a little test that I'll talk about in a second. So the espresso that I get from this grinder is pretty good. I don't have many big complaints about it. It is a conical burr grinder, so you're going to get more shots that are really thick and syrupy with a lot of body, but you are losing out on a little bit of clarity and acidity in the coffee. All that to say, the espresso you can get from this grinder is pretty good. So now I'm going to pull 2 more shots of espresso. I'm going to go 1 step finer and then 1 step coarser than the one we just did. And using that same 20-gram yield and 40-gram dose, look at how long those shots are taking, because then we can know about how much adjustability we have within the espresso range on this grinder. So I'm going to be really quick here, and let's fast forward to how long each shot took me. Okay, so I have just pulled 2 more shots of espresso. Like I mentioned earlier, the original shot was at setting 2. I did 1 step finer, so 1 click finer than 2, and 1 click coarser than 2. The 1 click finer than 2 took 1 minute and 5 seconds. At 2, like I said earlier, it took 35 seconds. At 1 click coarser than 2, it took 20 seconds. So this is my biggest complaint about this grinder, is although it can grind fine enough for espresso and pull a decent shot, we have pretty much almost no adjustability within that range. 1 step finer and that shot is way over extracted, it ran way too long, and 1 step coarser is way under extracted. So I pretty much have one setting that will work for this coffee, and in an espresso grinder I like to be able to adjust it so I can at least maneuver that time within 3 to 5 seconds. And that's really what you want to see, because espresso is such a finicky beverage that it sounds crazy to say, but a couple seconds you can really taste the difference, especially if you're a trained barista and you've been doing it long enough. So what does that mean for this as an espresso grinder? Well, really, if you are someone who has a serious home espresso machine and you like to dial in espressos as much as I do, then this grinder is not cut out for you. It just doesn't have the espresso adjustability that I would want to see in an espresso grinder. But if you are someone who has a cheaper espresso machine and maybe you don't care about dialing in as much, you just want to be able to grind for espresso, then this should be no problem for you. So now that I've talked about how this grinder performs for espresso, I want to quickly go over drip, and it does a pretty good job. It has enough settings in those ranges that you can dial in a coffee a little bit, and at those grind settings, it has a pretty nice uniform grind size. So I really don't have any complaints for this grinder as a drip grinder. I brewed a bunch of different coffees on it and they all tasted pretty good. So what are some things that we at HomeGrounds love about this grinder? Well, first off, at its price point, this is a great grinder for someone that wants to grind from espresso all the way to drip. There aren't many electric grinders out there that can do that do it well. And so having a grinder at this price point from a company like Fellow is really great. And to go off of that, Fellow, I've worked with them in the past, I've reviewed a lot of their products, and I like all of them. The Fellow Ode, I think, is one of the best home coffee grinders out there, and this is a great addition to their lineup. It looks sleek like most Fellow products, and they have good customer service, and I'm sure you won't have any issues if you purchase this grinder. As far as things that maybe we don't love as much, obviously I talked about the espresso on this grinder. I think if you are someone who is serious about home espresso, then this grinder may not be for you. Another thing is the mess up top here. Even after a couple doses, I can just show you really quick that we have a good amount of coffee up there. Now it's easy enough to just knock all that out and it's clean. So that's not a huge deal, but just something to be aware of. And then the last thing that, at least personally, I don't love is the shape of it. I'm not a big fan of this cylinder being a lot larger than the cylinder below it. And it just kind of looks a little bit funky to me, but that's a personal opinion. I've had mixed reviews from people talking about how it looks. I don't think that's a huge thing, but if you care about how a grinder looks, then maybe this is or isn't for you. So what are some final thoughts on the Fellow Opus? I think they did a great job making a grinder that can grind from espresso through any drip setting you would ever need. If you are someone who brews coffee all throughout the week and maybe occasionally wants to use it for espresso, this grinder is great for you. If on the flip side you are someone who brews espresso every day of the week and just want a grinder that can occasionally do drip coffee, then this may not be the best option for you. But all that being said, it's a very well-built grinder from a reputable company that makes great products. So that is everything about the Fellow Opus. Like I mentioned earlier, we will be having a few other videos comparing this grinder to a few other grinders in its price range. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy brewing.